This is the first message in a series of messages about the church, and the church is imperfect. The church, unfortunately, because it's imperfect, because it's made up of broken people, has been known to hurt people. It's been known to leave people feeling rejected, leave them feeling abandoned and even abused. And over these few messages, I'm going to be kind of hard on the church, and I feel a little bit better about doing that because just a few weeks ago, we talked about how much we love the church. And so I hope that nobody doubts my love for the church, my allegiance to the church. I believe that it's God's hope for the world. And so if you ever feel like, man, he just doesn't like the church, go back and listen a couple messages ago. I'll watch those on our website, and you'll know that I'm definitely passionate about the church. But I'm realistic about the church and her faults. I was blessed to grow up attending church. I first attended church in the womb. I went to church in a car seat. I attended church, went to Sunday school when I was a boy. I was blessed to have many opportunities to be in church. I have many memories from when I was a young boy of life wrapped around the church, involved in the church. And I wasn't always a Christian because those things aren't necessarily they're not necessarily connected. You can attend church and not be a Christian. And I went to church for many years as a child, attending church, but not a Christian. And there came a point in my life where I committed my life to Christ, and then I was attending church as a Christian. I didn't always attend church as a Christian, and I didn't always attend church as a fan of church. I wasn't always really enthused about going to church. There were some times that my parents forced me to go to church. And moms and dads, I recognize that there are times that your sons and your daughters may not be as enthused about going to church. I think that we have a great kids program here, that many of our kids enjoy coming to church. They're excited about coming to church. There's most likely going to come a time when they're less enthused about going to church. I know that there are some parents that feel like they shouldn't force their children to go to church. I'm just going to give my personal opinion on that. My daughter doesn't want to go to school any day of the week, but I make her go. Thankfully, she's more excited about going to church than she is to school, so we haven't had that fight about church. But just as I feel it's important for her to be in school, I'm going to make sure that she's in church. And so moms and dads, I would encourage you to have that perspective. You wouldn't give them a choice about school. We believe that what we are teaching here is so very vital and important. So let me encourage you to continue to bring your children to church. And we're going to do our part to make sure it's a place where they enjoy coming, where they enjoy learning about God's Word. But you're going to need to make sure that it's a priority in your home. I wasn't always a fan of church, but I continued to go. And though I attended church for many years, through times that I was attending as I wasn't a believer, times that I attended that I wasn't that enthused about going to church, what that did is it gave me many opportunities to see the imperfections of the church. To know the church closely and see that it has parts of it that are broken, parts of it that are lacking. I've watched not only people in my own family be hurt by the church, but I've watched people in families of my friends. I've watched my mentors. I've watched fellow pastors and colleagues be hurt by the church. And many times when people respond to this idea of the church hurting someone, the church leaving someone feeling rejected or abandoned, is, well, hey man, there's people that gossip at your factory. And there's people that will betray your trust at your school. And there's people that are hypocrites at the ball field. I'm sure that there's some moms and dads at your kids' ball field that are judgmental. And that's a valid argument. However, in the church, it should be different. And when we have that mentality, we're setting the bar pretty low. For it has to have the mentality of, sure, there's going to be that type of conduct in the church because there's that kind of conduct everywhere. That's setting the bar very low because at the church, things should be different. We're called to live like Christ. We're called to be made different. And so because the bar is supposed to be set so high, we let down our defenses. We open up about our heartaches, and we open up about our faults, and we open up about our shortcomings. And when we are taken advantage of, that hurt is deep and long-standing. It's painful. For me, I carried church hurt with me for a very long time. It was only about 6 to 7 years ago that I experienced healing from that hurt that I experienced within the body of believers. But you know what's ironic about it is that I found healing within the church. You see, while the church can be a source of deep pain, it can also be the greatest source, or the source of the greatest healing. In the Scriptures, we have examples of people who were rejected, abandoned, or even abused by the church, people who were hurt deeply. But thankfully, what we see in these examples are those same people also experienced healing and restoration. Today, we're going to look at an individual who was rejected by followers of Jesus. But Jesus worked in spite of that rejection to bring restoration to that man's life. So look with me at Luke chapter 19. Jesus entered and passed through Jericho. Jesus is traveling to Jerusalem. He's making his final journey there for the Passover. When he gets to Jerusalem for Passover, that is when he'll be arrested and tried and executed. So Jesus is making his final trip to Jerusalem, and he's passing through Jericho. And behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus, which was the chief among the publicans. The publicans were the tax collectors, and he was the chief one. He was the boss. And he was rich. And he sought to see Jesus, who he was, and he could not for the press because he was of little stature. He was a short man. And he ran before and climbed up into a sycamore tree to see him, for he was to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up, saw him, and said unto him, Zacchaeus, he called him by name, make haste and come down, for today I must abide at your house. Not just I must visit, but I must abide at your house. And he made haste and came down and received him joyfully. And when they saw it, the crowd saw it, they all murmured, saying that he was gone to be a guest with a man that is a sinner. And Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, Behold, Lord, half of my goods I give to the poor. And if I have taken anything from any man by false accusation, I restore to him fourfold, or 4 times what I took. And Jesus said to him, This day is salvation come to this house, for as much as he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man is come to seek and to save that which is lost. I feel badly for Zacchaeus, not only because as he wants to see Jesus, nobody gives him an opportunity to see him, but I feel badly for Zacchaeus because the one thing that we remember about Zacchaeus' story more than anything else is that he was a short man. When I was growing up in the church, there was a song that we always used to sing about Zacchaeus. Are you familiar with it? Zacchaeus was a what? A wee little man. That's what and a wee little man was he. And do you know what the motions to that song are? Zacchaeus was a wee little man. I'm pretty sure as a kid, I thought that Zacchaeus was like 6 inches tall. That he was one of the little people from Gulliver's Travels. You know, that he was just this miniature guy. I'm sure that in heaven today, Zacchaeus just goes around meeting everybody that comes into heaven and saying, no, I wasn't 6 inches tall. Wasn't that short. But one thing we remember about his story was his stature. That's a part of the story, but it's kind of an aside. What we really need to know about Zacchaeus is that Zacchaeus was rejected by the crowd. This passage tells us that Jesus is passing through Jericho, and Zacchaeus hears about it, and he wants to see Jesus. Now, we don't know if Zacchaeus wanted to see Jesus because he knew how much he needed him, or because he was just curious. Maybe he was just wanting to see what all the fuss was about. Maybe he had heard about some of the miracles that Jesus did, and Zacchaeus said, this is my shot to see something amazing happen. Or maybe, like all of us, he just wanted to be in on all the action. So Zacchaeus wants to see Jesus, and we don't know at what point he is on his spiritual journey. We're not sure if he knows that he desperately needs Jesus to forgive him of his sins. You know what? There are many people that they have an interest or a curiosity about Jesus, and they don't know yet why they need Jesus. They don't know yet why they need to see Jesus. And they may come on Easter because they've just got a little bit of curiosity, or they come along with some friends, or because it's the day that the whole crowd gathers to be at church. And so they're searching for something, but they're not really sure what they're searching for yet. That may have been where Zacchaeus was. He wanted to see Jesus, but he wasn't really quite sure why he needed to see Jesus, or why he wanted to see Jesus. But Zacchaeus couldn't see, because there was a press of a crowd. Jericho was a large city. Many people would have been traveling through Jericho to Jerusalem for the Passover. It would have been a very busy time in Jericho, in addition to the many people who lived there. And now Jesus is coming through, and everybody wants to see him. You've probably been in a traffic jam that happens after a ball game or a concert. Everybody's trying to get out of the same place or into the same place at the same time. And normally the roads are big enough to handle everybody, but when there's a large crowd, it's just, you're going to have to wait. And everybody's making their way to Jerusalem, and Jericho is this crowded city, and nobody is letting Zacchaeus through so he can see. Now, Zacchaeus was a short man. So if you would let Zacchaeus through so that he could see, he's not going to block your view. But nobody gives him a place to stand so that he could see. Now, this might just seem like a detail of the story, that Zacchaeus didn't get there in time and he was a little late, and that he couldn't see. But what we find in the Gospel of Luke is that this was a common occurrence, that people who wanted to see Jesus couldn't see him. This was a recurring issue. The people who wanted to see Jesus couldn't. In Luke chapter 5, Luke tells us the story about a man who had lost his ability to walk. So 4 of his friends decide that they're going to take their friend to see Jesus, who is in a nearby village. They get each man on the corner of the pallet or bed that this lame man is laying on, and they carry him to the village where Jesus is. When they get to where Jesus is in a house teaching, and it's so crowded that they can't get in. Luke 5 tells us that they actually go up on the roof and tear up the roof, lower the man down by a rope so that they can get him to Jesus. Now, how inconsiderate was the crowd that they wouldn't make room for this lame man to see Jesus and be healed? Look back one chapter in your Bible, Luke 18. Luke 18 tells us this happens again. Luke 18 and verse 15 tells us that there were people bringing infants to Jesus. They're bringing their baby to Jesus. Jesus, we want you to bless our child. We want you to pray over our child. And the disciples say, no. Get these kids out of here. Can't you see Jesus is busy? He's got important things to do. What does Jesus say? Jesus says, suffer the little children to come unto me, for of such is the kingdom of God. Don't get in their way. So we've got this crowd that won't let the people into the house with this lame man. We've got the disciples that won't let the people with their children. Then look towards the end of Luke 18. Jesus is making his way into Jericho, and verse 35 tells us that as Jesus is drawing near to Jericho, he's getting close to the city where Zacchaeus is at. That there is a blind man begging outside of the city, and when he hears all of the commotion, that he hears that Jesus is there, he starts to call out to Jesus, please come help me. And what is just absolutely amazing is that the passage there tells us that the people who were leading the way told the blind man, be quiet. Stop making so much noise. Knock it off. Now the blind man ignores them and continues to call out to Jesus, and Jesus calls back to him. They find one another, and Jesus heals this blind man. But what we have again and again and again throughout Luke's gospel is that there are people who are following Jesus, they're walking with Jesus, they're listening to Jesus teach, but they're not making way for people who desperately need to meet Jesus to get to Jesus. Now you would think that in the crowd of people that are listening to Jesus teach about his love and his grace and his mercy, that they would have a deep desire for the most needy people around them to be able to get to Jesus. But what we see instead is, hey, would you stop? That's annoying. Hey, listen, I was here first. I'm sorry that you want to get in the house, but it's crowded in here. You're going to have to stand outside. I'm sorry that you're blind and begging for money, but Jesus has places to go. I know that you want Jesus to hold your baby, but he's got more important things to do. And when Jesus gets to Jericho and Zacchaeus wants to see Jesus, it's the same thing all over again. nobody makes way for him. You see, sometimes the people who follow Jesus come in between Jesus and the people who desperately need him. Now, it should have been that there was some type of plan in place that anyone who needed Jesus could make it to Jesus. But there was no such plan in place. Each of these instances, the person that needed to see Jesus was at a disadvantage. The crippled man who was relying on his friends to get him there. The infants who were being carried by their parents. The blind man who couldn't see Jesus but was calling out to him. And Zacchaeus who was too short to see over the crowd. And friends, let me plead with you. Let us be a crowd that follows Jesus, that makes sure that anyone who wants to see Jesus, no matter their disadvantage, no matter their station in life, that they have access to him. That we do not become blinded by by what's going on to see why Jesus is here, but that we always give access to people who need to meet Jesus that opportunity. This crowd should have had a heartbeat for making sure that anyone had access to Jesus, but they didn't. When Zacchaeus was of short stature, that put him at a disadvantage, but it also seems that Zacchaeus didn't have a whole lot of friends in Jericho. Zacchaeus was a publican or a tax collector. Now, in our minds, I don't have to convince you why someone who collects taxes is unpopular, right? But this was not just someone who was collecting taxes. It was someone collecting taxes for the Romans, who was the occupying force in Jerusalem and Jericho. This was someone who was collecting taxes for the enemy. And not only was Zacchaeus a tax collector or a publican, he was the head tax collector or publican in Jericho. And Jericho was one of 3 regional tax collection locations. The Romans would set up tax location centers in places where there was a great amount of commerce or travel. Jericho was one of those cities. According to John MacArthur, they had taxes on everything. There was a tax on your cart. There was a tax on how many wheels you had on your cart. There was a tax on the animals that pulled your cart. There was the tax on any merchandise within your cart. There was a personal tax and there was a poll tax. Does this sound familiar to anyone else? There was a tax on everything. If they could have taxed the air and the sunshine, they would have. So when you saw Zacchaeus coming, you crossed to the other side of the street because you didn't want to be near that guy. If he spoke to you, it was probably going to be to take your money. Not only was he a tax collector, but he was a rich tax collector. Now, he would have made some money on a legitimate basis working for the Romans, but he made it a great deal of money in illegitimate ways by strong-arming people and taking advantage of people. Zacchaeus was short, and that was out of his control, but he was also a thief, and that was very much in his control. He was at a disadvantage because of who he was and also because of the things that he had done. Now, I'm sure if you were to ask everybody in the crowd, hey, why didn't you let Zacchaeus through so he could see? I don't think anybody would have said just outright, I hate that guy's guts. But he didn't have any friends that were looking out for him. He didn't have anyone that was welcoming him up to see Jesus. And if you need any further proof of what the people thought of Zacchaeus, look at verse 7. Because when Jesus goes to Zacchaeus' house, the people all murmur and say he's going to the home of a sinner. Now, in the Greek, the word for murmur or grumble is an onomatopoeia. Are you familiar with onomatopoeia? That's when a word sounds like what it does. So a babbling brook, babble is onomatopoeia because it sounds like what it says. A belch, that's onomatopoeia because it sounds like what it is. And when the people murmured, that's what it sounded like. They murmured. Oh, can you believe he's going over there to the house of that sinner? They were all disappointed that Jesus was going to hang out with Zacchaeus. They were upset that Jesus was going to spend time with him. Now, Zacchaeus struggled to see Jesus because he was short, which was outside of his control, and because he was a thief, which was within his control. Now, in Jesus' day, they thought that everything about you was your own fault. A good example of this is one time Jesus and his disciples were making their way through a city, and they saw a blind man on the street. And this is what the disciples said.
Jesus, is that guy blind because of his own sins or because of the sins of his parents? In their mind, anyone that was disabled or handicapped, it was their own fault. So you can understand why when this blind man is calling out to Jesus as he comes into Jericho, they said, hey, be quiet. They thought, you have gotten what you deserve, buddy. It's your own fault. Now, that was the perspective or the culture in Jesus' day. Now, in our day, we've swung to the opposite end of the spectrum. Today, nothing is your fault. You were born that way, and I have no right to judge you. Everything that you do, that's just in your genes. It's because of your context. It's because of the environment that you grew up in. It's because of your family. And we've swung to the opposite end. In reality, there are things that we can't handle, that are outside of our control, and then there are things that are very much within our control. And probably for all of us, there are things that are outside of our control that contributed to the fact that we know Jesus or we don't. I won the lottery being born to the parents that I was born to, who took me to church from the time that I was a baby. That was outside of my control. But there also had to come a point when I placed my faith in Jesus. Some people are born into situations, into backgrounds that lead them in a horrible path, but they also choose to stay on that path. Zacchaeus couldn't handle, he couldn't determine his own height or his stature, but he could determine the life that he lived, and he had chosen to be a thief. Perhaps this morning you feel like there's no place for you because you weren't as fortunate as I was to grow up in a Christian family. Perhaps this morning you feel like there's no place for you in church because of your background, which you had no control over. Or perhaps this morning you feel like there's no place for you in church because you've made some really bad decisions. You've chosen to be the thief. You've chosen to be the tax collector. Zacchaeus couldn't see Jesus because he was short. That was no fault of his own. And Zacchaeus was rejected by the crowd because he was a tax collector, something that he had chosen to do. But with both of those barriers standing in his way of seeing Jesus, what happens next in the story is amazing. Because Zacchaeus finds a sycamore tree to climb up into, and as Jesus is making his way through the crowd, he looks up into this tree that would have been pretty short, but just tall enough for Zacchaeus to see over everyone's head. And he looks up at Zacchaeus and he calls him by name. You see, Zacchaeus was short and he was a tax collector, but Jesus looked over all of that and called him by name. And friend, I want you to know that no matter your background and no matter the choices that you have made in this life, Christ looks over all of that and calls you by name. He calls out to you. In fact, that's the story of what God does throughout the Scriptures. He looks over our nature and He overlooks our choices to call us by name and welcome us into His fellowship. Jesus looked past Zacchaeus' stature and his sin. And friend, He looks past your nature, your background, your choices, and He calls you by name. That's what God's been doing from the very beginning. Think back to the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve sin. They do what is wrong. They know that they've done wrong, so what do? They go hide from God. You know how that's going to end. But God comes to the garden and He starts calling their names. Why? God knew where they were. He knew exactly what they had done. He knew they were hiding, but He goes to the garden and begins to call their names because He's giving them the opportunity to come out from their hiding place. He's calling their names. Lincoln loves to jump out and scare me. But you know what? There are very few times that he actually scares me. Because I can see him. He doesn't do a good job of hiding. He's not very intimidating. But when he jumps out, I act surprised and shocked. God knows where you're at this morning. He knows your background, and He knows the choices that you've made. He knows your situation, and He knows your shame. But this morning, He is walking through your life, calling to you, giving you the chance to come out from your hiding place, giving you the chance to step out, climb down from that sycamore tree, like He did for Zacchaeus. Now think about this moment. Zacchaeus is in this tree. Jesus is walking through Jericho, crowds of people everywhere. And Jesus stops what he is doing, and he looks up at Zacchaeus among all of these people, and he speaks directly to him. And he says, Zacchaeus, I'm coming to your house today. That's amazing. But the real amazing part had happened well before that. Because while Jesus may stop in the middle of the crowded, busy street, ignoring all of the commotion and the chaos and overlooking everyone that rejected Zacchaeus to call out to him, God had done so much more before that moment. Because before he crossed that street and he looked up into that tree and called out to Zacchaeus, he crossed heaven and the galaxies to come here to earth so that he could call out to every one of us. And friend, whatever things that have happened in our life and whoever has harmed us and whatever church has turned us away, that is a small thing in comparison to the things that God has overcome so that he can call out to us and call our name. And friend, I want you to know that God calls your name this morning, and I hope that you will not miss that invitation that he gives you because of the crowd around you and the fact that they've rejected you. Because the God of the universe has come down to call your name and invite you to spend some time with him. Several years ago, there was a young man that I had ministered to at the Warwick County Jail, and he'd been transferred up to another facility in Plainfield, Indiana. I was going to be passing through that city with Brother Helms as we attended an executive committee meeting for the state association. We would be returning on a Saturday afternoon, and so I called the chaplain there at the Plainfield Correctional Facility to see what I would need to do to be able to visit him as I passed right by so that I could just stop by and say hello. I got there on that Saturday. I had all of the paperwork that the chaplain had told me to bring. I stood in line, finally got up to the table, presented my paperwork, and they said, "Sir, I'm sorry. You're not going to be able to go back." The chaplain didn't leave a note letting us know to expect you, so we can't let you in. I said, well, he told me that he was going to let somebody know. He was going to email the person in charge so that I would be able to get in. I said, "I'm sorry, we never got it." Now, that was frustrating. And I understand that there were policies and procedures in place that someone couldn't just show up and pretend to be a pastor and get to speak to someone in the jail. As frustrated as I was that I was rejected and wasn't able to go in, the woman behind me, who had traveled from Fort Wayne several hours to see her son, they told her that she wouldn't be able to go in because there was no strap on the back of her sandal. There was a dress code that you had to keep, and she didn't meet it because of her shoes. And she said, well, if I run down the Dollar General and I buy a new pair of shoes, will I be able to get in? They said, "I'm sorry, that we only have visitation open for another 20 minutes. You'll have to get back in that amount of time." And she immediately ran out. And I thought, man, that's just tragic. And I understand that there has to be rules and policies in place for specific reasons. But here this woman has made this journey all this way to see her son who she very much loves. And she's going to be kept apart from him because of this small technicality. And friend, it would be equally as tragic if the God of the universe would span heaven and earth to come to invite you into a loving and grace-filled relationship, and you miss it because something that some person failed to do or said out of turn. And if there's ever been a place or a time where you have come to church and you felt rejected or turned away or judged, friend, please do not allow that small thing in comparison with what God has done to keep you from experiencing his grace and love. I don't mean to minimize the pain that you might have experienced, but friend, let me help you see that in perspective of what God is doing and what he has done to call you by name, that is no reason to miss out on a relationship with him. Jesus looked up at Zacchaeus and said, "Zacchaeus, I'm coming to your house today." And oh, what a tragedy it would have been if Zacchaeus said, "You know what? These people that are following you, they're mean. So I'm going to pass." Zacchaeus welcomed him with open arms. It says that he received him with great joy. And do you see what Jesus says here to Zacchaeus? He says, Zacchaeus, I'm going to come and I'm going to abide at your house today. The word that the crowd uses for Jesus going to Zacchaeus' house in verse 7 is a compound word, which means to take things apart. In other words, he was going over to Zacchaeus' house to kick off his shoes and to take off his robe and to make himself comfortable. And they were disgusted that Jesus was going to go make himself comfortable at the house of a publican. But friend, that's exactly what God has done. He sent his Son to come to dwell with us, to kick off his shoes and take off his robe, to make himself at home in our hearts and in our lives. And while the people of God are imperfect, and they may have left you feeling rejected, that is exactly the opposite of what Christ has done, because he has come to dwell with you and to make himself at home in your life. Jesus goes to Zacchaeus' house and everything changes. The passage tells us that Zacchaeus says, I will give half of what I own to the poor. And if I have wronged anyone, I will pay them back fourfold. Now, that wasn't in the law anywhere. Zacchaeus wasn't required to do that, but the grace that he experienced was so powerful that he was willing to do whatever he could to show his gratitude to Christ. And Jesus says salvation has come to this house this day because Zacchaeus had accepted the gracious invitation of Jesus Christ. Zacchaeus wasn't saying, what do I have to do? Zacchaeus was saying, I will do whatever I can. You see, people may have rejected Zacchaeus because of the things that he did, and Jesus looked over it to spend time with him, but Jesus did not condone his thievery. And after he spent time with Zacchaeus, Zacchaeus was a completely different man. He was changed. He went from being a thief to being generous. The same hands that had taken from others was now offering half of what he had out to the poor. And friends, while Jesus overlooks your background and he overlooks your choices and grace and he calls out to you by name, he doesn't intend to leave you where he found you. Jesus called out to Zacchaeus in that sycamore tree, but he left Zacchaeus' house a completely different man. Throughout the Gospels, people have a problem with the fact that Jesus goes and eats with sinners. But you know why Jesus did it? Because most of the time he had dessert with saints. Because by the time the meal was through, the person's life had been changed. That's what God wants to do for us. He looks past our fault and our background. He looks past our sins and our situation, but then he leaves us completely different. And if God can do that in the midst of a crowd that rejected Zacchaeus, I believe that he can do that here in this crowd that I think absolutely loves you and is glad that you are here. Charles Spurgeon has been called the Prince of Preachers, one of the most famous preachers. But Spurgeon said if it hadn't been for a snowstorm in a small primitive Methodist church, he may never come to Christ. He was on his way to church one Sunday morning, and the snow was coming down, and the roads were in horrible shape. So instead of going to the church that he normally went to, he turned down the lane to the small primitive Methodist church. And he said, the only thing that I knew about the primitive Methodists is people complained that they sang so loud that it made your head hurt by the time that the service was over. But I went anyway. On that snowy morning, there were only about 12 people in the congregation, and the pastor didn't even show up. So a man who was in the congregation, Spurgeon says, I don't know if he was a tailor or a shoe cobbler, he stood up and he presented the text from Isaiah, look unto me and live. And the man just kept repeating the passage because he had no sermon prepared. But then he looked back and he saw Spurgeon in the back and he said, young man, you look miserable. Spurgeon said, I was miserable, but I'd never had anybody call me out from the pulpit before, and I don't recommend it. He said, but I realized in that moment that I was miserable, but if I looked to Jesus, I could live. And I experienced his saving grace in that moment. And a church with just a handful of people, and a man presenting a message that he hadn't prepared for, in the middle of that dysfunction, in the middle of that snowstorm, God's grace changed Charles Spurgeon's life. And friend, I know that church is messy because it's made up of messy people. And I know that church is imperfect because it's led by imperfect people. But I believe that in the middle of this crowd, Jesus is calling out to you and saying, I want to come abide in your life. I want to come reside in your heart. Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer.